In the co-main event, Valentina Shevchenko versus El-Kheer, featuring Ian Gary taking on Kenan Song, Bo Nickel taking on Jamie Pickett, Gamrot taking on Jalen Turner, Jeff Neal taking on Shakhmat Rakhmonov, Mano Martinez taking on Cameron Saman, Jessica Penne taking on Tabitha Ritchie. Amanda Ribas taking on Vivian Rougeau, Derek Brunson taking on Dricus Duplessis, Julian Marquez taking on Marc-Andre Barreau. Who else is in this card? Farid Basharat taking on Jamal Blackshear. And then we were just coming off of that Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury win. How about that? Who would have ever expected that Tommy Fury was going to win that fight? At the same time, it was almost like saying, well, why would you not expect Tommy Fury to win now in comparison to someone like Jake Paul? But going into it, in reality, you really had a lot of boxers and MMA guys going for Jake Paul because of the fact that we have this thing in sports called recency bias. But nonetheless, that is gone and over with. That fight is done. And now we move on from Saudi Arabia all the way to the other deserts of the other side of the world, which is none other than Las Vegas. But before we get into the kicks and the punches and the storylines of UFC 285, let's talk about the truth in terms of the sports washing that goes on in Saudi Arabia, or what a lot of people claim as sports washing. So here's something a lot of people have to understand. It's something that's done all throughout the world. It's no different than the United States competing in China during the 2008 Olympics, coming off of the Iraq War, trying to win some sort of hearts and minds war in the world that pretty much had a huge opposition towards this aggression that they've had going on in that part of the world. So sports washing is a reality. At the same time, it's also really misplaced in anger and also just misguided in the way that other people like to convey it. For example, a lot of people like to always cite the Soviet Union in terms of what? In terms of the fact that throughout that time, they've had their amateur athletes drugged up, roided up, juiced up, and only for the simple fact that they wanted to create a sense of glory for Russian Soviet sports and their systems that they wanted to convey to the world. But then you have in the United States on the other side of that, you almost have kind of what you see as a volunteer force of people that choose to be athletes. In other words, you hear a lot of Olympic athletes that go into these situations where they are just, I don't know, not being paid by any sense. Because historically, if you're an American athlete going into the Olympics, your whole entire thing is that you want to compete in the purest form possible, whatever that means. And again, this is why I say there's a lot of misguided direction in terms of how people look at sports washing as a whole. Because the way that one country looks at it is not the same as the way the other countries may look at it. Now, in Saudi Arabia's case, you're seeing a high flux of, let's say, boxing events, UFC. They signed a deal with the WWE in recent times. They've had F1 Formula racing. They've had horse racing going on a Saturday, by the way, which was coming from the source of Ariel Helwani, mentioning of why Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury didn't happen on a Saturday, but rather on a Sunday of which is rather unusual, but not so much in terms of Jake Paul's fights and not so much in the WWE sense. And even nowadays, if you notice the WWE, they're now doing shows on a Saturday night for whatever reason that is. And so you got to think, what is it that people want to attack Saudi Arabia for in terms of sports washing? Is there any legitimate reason behind what they're talking about, behind their attacks, behind their accusations? Or is it just a normal practice that everybody else does but is being conveyed and viewed differently through whosever eyes and lenses chooses to look at it negatively or positively? Now, one of the things that you can't deny about Saudi Arabia is that obviously it is the fatherland of all Muslims, being that it is a place where Mecca has existed. And even in some recent YouTube videos, they've come out saying something to the effect that the Mount Moses was somehow discovered there rather than it was supposed to be in Egypt. Now, I don't know the full story of that. You guys can look up the new discoveries that they have in Saudi Arabia in terms of biblical places that took place in the Old and New Testament and something to that extent, which one, you could argue and say that maybe perhaps it's a propaganda tool to create some kind of buzz around Saudi Arabia more than it already has, being that they already have one of the three holiest cities in the Islamic faith within that country. And not to mention the fact that the country in and of itself derives not only their economic prosperity through oil, but also through the revenues that come in through the Hajj system, of where a lot of people come and make pilgrimage towards Mecca. And then you can imagine the hotel accommodations that accumulate out of that, on top of the fact that it's a country that is just naturally going to draw a lot of tourism, Muslims around the world, and even people from third world nations that somehow need to find a different opportunity or different career paths in that world of prosperity and high economic growth. Now, also, the other thing that you can't deny about Saudi Arabia is that, yes, that is one aspect of that country, is that, yes, it is the land of the Muslims. It is the land of the top scholars in the world in terms of understanding Sunni Orthodox Salafi Islam. And not only that, it is also a country that has a lot of controversies within its government and its royal family. Now, one highlighted case being known as one of the journalists of Saudi Arabia, Khashoggi, supposedly and allegedly getting killed by Saudi intelligence inside a Saudi embassy within Turkey, and only to which he went there to visit to somehow renew his passport or to make ends of whatever it is that he was trying to solve in that particular time that eventually led to his demise. Now, that is very worrying for a lot of Western journalists, and they look at that and they say to themselves, well, wow, Khashoggi is really this person that was just doing his job, but then somehow, in some way, this government decides to go off him. So, of course, you're going to see a lot of unfavorable stances towards Saudi Arabia, and you're also going to see some sort of fair assessment in that, especially with the controversies that they've had with the weapons purchases that they've made with the United States. If you notice, one recent, not recent, but a very well-known video of where you see Donald Trump as a sitting president visiting Saudi Arabia, selling weapons to the Saudis, and then even making jokes with the Crown Prince bin Salman, who is considered to be the country's Ministry of Defense, talking to Donald Trump, and Donald Trump joking with him, saying something to the effect of, well, we made you save this much money when you bought weapons from us. We could have made you paid more, and we know that you could afford it. Jokingly saying that in a lighthearted way of trying to banter with the Prince of Saudi Arabia. But that's the reality of that country and its aspect of what it is that they're trying to promote in sports, and the realities of the backlashes that you see with journalists from combat sports and throughout mainstream media. Also, you've seen and noticed in the recent times the shift that the world is going through right now. You see, Saudi Arabia and the United States have always had this special relationship up until recently, especially within the Joe Biden administration. Now, why is that? Well, for one, Russia is a factor in that aspect and in that internal conflict that they have going on within their countries and their nations and their governments, and the things that they have going on within those diplomatic affairs in the global stage. So, as you know, Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the United States firmly stands against this, to the point where they go and support this country with $500 million of aid in military equipment to whatever it is that they can use to defeat the Russians. And without the United States officially really sending any of their troops, but using some sort of proxy method to fight Russia in those covert ways. Well, now Saudi Arabia is in this position where they live in the other side of the world, that across the Atlantic from the United States, to where they have to be neighbors with Europe, and then they have to be neighbors with other Gulf states around them. And of course, there's Israel in the factor, and then not to mention the aspect of Russia and its influence throughout the Middle East and Africa. Well, lo and behold, the United States is slowly drifting away its relationship from Saudi Arabia, based on the fact that Saudi Arabia has its own interest, and a lot of that interest may sometimes be in terms of aligning themselves with Russia. So that is the geopolitical game that is being played right now around the world. And sports washing or sports propaganda, or using sports as a way to promote your nation, is nothing new in any era that you could think of. You look at in World War II with Max Schmeling, you had him representing the Nazi German party in those days. You had someone like, let's say, Ivan Drago in the Cold War. Even though it's a fictional character, nonetheless, you've had real Ivan Dragos throughout that time, such as Alexander Karelin in the amateur wrestling world, represent Russia in those terms, in terms of trying to show the world their supremacy. And then, of course, as you know, in the Icarus documentary, you've noticed that Russia has historically gone out of their way to juice their athletes to the gills in order to somehow gain some kind of traction to the world, as to show that they are the supremacy of sports. Russia has all the best athletes in the world. And in the United States, as I mentioned earlier, what they like to do is show this aspect of freedom. So the athletes don't really get paid, but at the same time, they live kind of broke. You look at them in the Olympic centers that they live at, they're not really living with a lot of money. They're not given a lot of funding, and a lot of them live kind of broke. But they can only hope to win the admiration of their country through the sponsorships that they get after the fact, after they win the gold medal. And just like with Anthony Joshua, obviously, I don't know how they treat the GB team in the Olympics, but I can't imagine it's not any different than the United States, a capitalist world that tells you you have to fight for everything that you own and that you have to earn everything for your keep. And it's all great and a noble way of looking at life, but then you have these countries that do nothing but fund their athletes to go into the Olympics, such as Cuba. And by the way, Yoel Romero, the former UFC 185 contender, was a part of that experiment. And one can even argue that he was drugged up since he was a kid with the insane level of muscles that he has and his longevity, even throughout his mid 40s, to be able to continue and compete right around this time. Well, that's the reality of sports washing and sports in governments and how they want to convey the narrative of whatever story it is that they want to tell. Now, with Saudi Arabia, they have this thing called a Vision for 2030, which is what they're trying to do is create this image of a Western friendly Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, a Saudi Arabia that is willing to make deals and cooperate with any country that is out there. And that also includes the United States and Russia. But nonetheless, that's the reality of that. And we're going to move on to UFC 285 because one of the most interesting aspects of this fight is that you have Jon Jones, who is one of the greatest fighters of all time. And what's great about that is when you have a fighter in that type of magnitude, in that type of space, it does create a certain level of attraction, especially since he hasn't fought from February of 2020 until now, February of 2023. So realistically, Jon Jones has been out for 3 years. You compare that with Georges St-Pierre when he retired back in 2013. When did he come back? 2017 to move up a weight and defeat Michael Bisping for his second world championship that he has ever gained in his entire career. And one of the few out of the many men that has competed in the UFC to have done it. Now Jones is here in the same category 3 years later, because Georges St-Pierre was the one that came back 4 years later, but had a real retirement, as opposed to Jon Jones that just didn't fight in between those years based on the fact that he's, for lack of a better term, a fighter that doesn't really need money or isn't broke. So he can sit out for that long. And then a lot of it had to do with the negotiations of feeling that he deserved to get paid more, and rightfully so. So he sat out and vacated the 205 belt, as you've seen, the way that it got passed around from Jan Blachowicz winning the vacant title after Jon Jones. And then after that, you had Jan Blachowicz getting beat by Glover Teixeira. And now Glover Teixeira gets beat by Yuri. And then Yuri falls out. In comes Jamal Hill to take the place of fighting for Yuri. And now he fights Glover and wins the belt in Brazil. And here we are. And then Francis Ngannou obviously becomes the heavyweight champion after trying for the second time against Stipe Miocic, finally knocking him out, and then defending his title against none other than his old training partner, Cyril Gane, which is the guy that you see right here fighting this weekend right against him. So Jon Jones is one of the greatest fighters of all time, if not ever. And this is something that you will hear from Khabib's dad, who has flat out said, in the light of the controversy of him and his son being put in this comparison of him and Jon Jones, he basically said that Jon Jones is a gift of God. And then you have Dana White singing all the praises that he could for Jon Jones. Then you have Nick Pete from BT Sport saying that Jon Jones is his favorite fighter, and maybe because Jones is a Scottish name, and maybe that has something to do with it, or just the simple fact that Jon Jones is really one of the greatest fighters of all time, and somebody that you never really lost a bet with. If you betted for him all throughout this entire career that he's had, this illustrious career that he's had, for that matter of fact. But the problem is, in the recent times, and once again, we are going to look at the word here is recency bias, very similar to what happened with Paul and Fury, because we all thought that Jake Paul was going to come in here and win based on the recency that we've seen in his performance as opposed to Tommy, and not even taking into consideration that Tommy was an exhibition bout within a 2 days notice of that fight being put together, and then being fallen apart from its original opponent to only finding this opponent that was only able to do an exhibition for a certain amount of rounds. So we judge him based off of that. And then these other opponents that he's had with 100 losses. But this is the same thing that we're doing with Jon Jones. We're looking at Jon Jones like he is the greatest of all time. This infallible idea that he's going to lose. And then it's like going into heavyweight from the years that he was in light heavyweight and then talking about how he was going to go into heavyweight. We never once took into consideration how he would really do in the heavyweight division, because we didn't take into factors of him being able to use his size, his length, and his width advantage. The problem is none of that exists in this fight with Ciryl Gane. And then here's another factor that's even deadlier of them all. You're dealing with a Jon Jones that is a little bit more flat-footed, maybe a little bit slower as a heavyweight, because I had mentioned in the past previous podcasts talking about the Jon Jones-Ciryl Gane fight, as Jon Jones doesn't really have the type of footwork that Ciryl Gane has. And then going into the heavyweight division, you got to wonder to yourself if that's going to slow him down, because some guys become a little bit slow when they gain weight, and then some guys, it just really doesn't affect them, or just affects very little of them, because obviously there's a diminishing return that you get when you get bigger, or when you get smaller, or when you move up a weight, or when you move down a weight. There's always a slight diminishing return, or a slight diminishing improvement, or leveling up of some sort. But that's one of the things we're going to find out during this week, because we just label Jon Jones as the greatest of all time and somebody that's just going to walk through Ciryl Gane easily. But that could be a factor. That could be the reality of it. I always say that Jon Jones's pedigree, being an American athlete and being that he has two brothers that are in the NFL, and by the way, while his two brothers were in the NFL, one of them was also a state wrestler while he was competing as a football player. And these are the type of people that Jon Jones grew up with, and the type of people that he trained with in his house, and the type of expectations of excellence that he had to model after as an MMA fighter, being that he had two brothers that were successful football players while they were scholastic athletes during their high school to college days. And then while Arthur Jones, the big brother, was a Super Bowl champion with the Baltimore Ravens, or whatever team that he has played for, to do that with. And then comes his little brother Chandler Jones, which is a very athletic version of Jon Jones in the NFL sense. And then you look at Jon Jones and you think, well, none of that translates anywhere in the cage. You see, he's strong, he hits you hard, he knows how to use his height and his advantage and his reach. But in the recent times, it's not like when in his younger days you saw him come out with pure explosion. The way that he came out with a flying knee against Shogun Rua in his title fight against him. The way that he came out with blazing, spitting back elbows that he used to do before his championship days. And the way that he took out Lyoto Machida, choked him out, left him almost unconscious, and then dropped his body on the floor after guillotine choking him, with the strong grip that he has going on. So this is what you see, and this is what you know about Jon Jones, and all throughout his consecutive wins that he's had going into his championship fights in the light heavyweight division. And also considering the fact that he has all these advantages. But now you're in the theater of the unknown, because when you look at Cyril Gane, you look at the way that he throws his body kicks, you got to start thinking to yourself, what kind of kicks is it that Jon Jones is going to do or counter from Cyril Gane? And what kind of counter or defense did he have in body kicks when Dominic Reyes was laying it on him? And in hindsight, you take a look at what happened with Dominic Reyes today and how his career fell out after the Jon Jones loss, which, by the way, many people never really thought of it as a loss to any degree. But then you also have another factor of Thiago Santos. You got to think, where is he at now in the streak that he's gone through? You got to think of all these opponents that Jon Jones has had and where they're at. Rampage Jackson, where's he at? Okay, maybe you could argue that he's now a little bit over the tooth and retired. Same thing with Lyoto Machida. Same thing with Shogun Rua. Managed to survive all throughout this time until he had to fight that Ukrainian fighter not too long ago in the last Brazilian card. And then Matt Hamill, a guy who arguably a lot of people said beat Jon Jones because of the disqualification, but if you were there and saw that fight, you would think otherwise. It was only because of the differences of the 12-6 elbow that he was throwing, as opposed to throwing an elbow in a horizontal manner, which is deemed one illegal and in the other is deemed illegal, but nonetheless controversial to its reality. So even if, yes, Matt Hamill walked away with that win, and Jon Jones, you could argue, really won that fight and was finishing him, okay, where's Matt Hamill at now? So you look at these opponents that Jon Jones was able to beat. He was able to beat them at the right time and at the right age that he was at, and at the right time where a lot of these guys were already on their way out of the business. That's something a lot of people don't take into consideration. But also, what a lot of people don't take into consideration is how easily Cyril Gane was out-wrestled by the likes of Francis Ngannou. And by the way, Francis Ngannou was able to do that with an injured knee of some sort, bad legs going into that fight, and he was able to dump him on his head. So what do we think Jon Jones is going to do with the pedigree that he has growing up as this American athlete slash wrestler slash one of the greatest and most creative mixed martial arts fighters of all time? Now, the other problem with that is you got to ask yourself, is that the same Jon Jones that's going to show up? And we have to think to ourselves, Jon Jones, throughout his career, has proclaimed he never really took a lot of his training seriously the way that he should have. But this time he felt like he did. So a lot of people are going to look at that and say, yeah, that's a shoe-in for sure that he's going to win because of that. He's a lot more focused than he was before. So what do you think he's going to do to this guy that a lot of people are looking at as mediocre? Well, the problem with that is you got to ask yourself, is Jon Jones overtraining? And overtraining is an aspect that a lot of people don't really take into consideration. By the way, Jake Paul cites that he was sick going into this fight with Tommy Fury. Okay, I'm not doubting him for saying that whatsoever. You want to know why? Because here's the thing. He's training out here in this part of the world, whether it be California or whether it be in the West Indies of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean and this and that, maybe sometimes in Florida, okay, maybe he spent a few times in England training there. Nonetheless, one of the things that these places all have in common is that they're not as hot as Saudi Arabia. So perhaps maybe there's a little bit of a shock to your body to where you're in one temperature of a certain climate of the world to another, and then you go into one part of the world that's really hot. Yes, there is a factor to where that can somehow hinder you or do that to you. But then I also thought to myself, well, I'm sure Jake Paul really trained his butt off for this fight, but sometimes training too hard can be the line of overtraining and potentially injuring yourself, and then also just catching certain colds or certain immune um, deficiencies that you're going to have that makes you susceptible to sneezing, having coughs, having fevers, having chills of some sort. Yes, these are all realities of overtraining. So one has to think, yes, John Jones is training the hardest that he's ever done in his entire life, but is it training hard and training diligent, or is it overtraining? And I thought about that, and I looked at who John Jones is training with at the moment, which is none other than Henry Cejudo. And one of the things that I really love about Henry Cejudo's training regimen is that he says that he listens to his body, but not only that, he uses the heart monitor to show that if he, let's say, has a certain resting heart rate to a certain day, he's not going to train, or he's going to train light, and he's going to decide what it is that he's going to do that day based on how his body feels, which I think is highly genius. And not only that, I think very good to understanding how you can level up your performance. And him doing that and him training with John Jones, you have to think maybe there's a correlation to the diligence that John Jones is going to display in this fight. But then you look at Cyril Gane and you think to yourself, what are the two hardest fights that John Jones has ever experienced in his entire life? And one, you can cite that with Alexander Gustafsson in the first fight, and then his last fight with Dominic Reyes. What do Dominic Reyes and Alexander Gustafsson both have in common? You know what that is? They both are very elusive. They know how to fight you in and out. They know how to dart in and out, very similar to a fence fighter. You know, those fencing guys that go on guard and try to jab the sword at you. Those guys that wear white, yeah. That's the type of fighting style that those guys can offer. The darting in and out movement. And John Jones had some serious problems with that. But guess who also is really good at the darting in and out movement? Cyril Gane. So, will John Jones have a problem in this fight based on that? Yes. But will Cyril Gane also have problems getting out wrestled? And by the way, Cyril Gane cited something to the effect that he rarely trains hard, only for his up-and-coming fights and this and that. And then John Jones came and replied something to the effect of where, oh, well, I smell that this is a trap. And lo and behold, it is. There's a certain level of trapness that these fighters do. Like, you look at Mayweather leading up to some of his old fights, you see him eat at a taco stand or drink soda in between. Although one argues that there's some sort of method to that madness, of which you're trying to somehow increase a certain level of sugar in you after you just did a hard workout, to some kind of muscle recovery mechanism that you're trying to do with that. Yes, maybe there's an aspect of that, but then maybe there's just this aspect of mental warfare that you're trying to make it seem like to your opponent you're not really training your hardest, or maybe you're telling the truth. But this is what makes this fight very mysterious, and what we always constantly say in this show every week in and week out. It is the theater of the unknown. So in one of the first fights that you're going to get of the night, you're going to have Farid Basharat, who's 9-0, taking on Demo Blackshear, who fought Yusuf Zalaz and lost to him, and has a 12-4-1 record against Farid Basharat, who's 9-0. I'm going to have to go with Farid on this one. Probably a decision for Farid Basharat. And then Jessica Penne versus Tabitha Ritchie, 7-1. I'm going to have to go with Tabitha Ritchie with majority or unanimous decision on this one. Strong top game at the strawweight division. Jessica Penney's 40 years old. Okay, I'm going to tell you guys, this is my opinion. Maybe female fighters historically just don't really age well. In that particular time frame, you look at Holly Holmes, you look at Ronda Rousey early on in her career, and then you look at Misha Tate. That's what I'm going off of. And the fact that Tabitha Ritchie just has a strong top game, I can see her taking her down and just grinding her the entire fight. So, yeah, unanimous decision for Tabitha Ritchie on that one. Mano Martinez taking on Cameron Saman. I'm going to have to go with Cameron Saman in that one. Last fight, 7-0 against Mano Martinez, who's 10-3. Has wins over Guido Canetti, fought Ronnie Lawrence. I'm going to go with Cameron Saman on that one. There's a lot of undefeated guys in this card, and rightfully so. I think that a lot of these guys that are undefeated, taking on many of these guys with 50 records of some sort, I think is some sort of a setup, and this isn't any different. And plus, Cameron Saman trains with Dricus du Plessis, so I think he's going to be very fully prepared to go into this fight. I got a decision on him. Then you got Ian Gary taking on Keenan Song. Ian Gary, crisp hands, has been training at the Sanford MMA with the likes of Shafkat, and then you have Michael Chandler in there. I can see him go for a KO win in this one, and even a submission after he follows up with rocking his opponent. Now, Keenan Song, okay, he's had a fight with Max Griffin, hasn't really been active, has had 2 fights since 2019. In comparison to Ian Gary, he seems to have been fighting in a lot of these big main cards and with pay-per-views in it. I mean, he hasn't really been placed in these smaller cards of, let's say, the Apex or the small city shows, but rather he's just constantly being put in these Vegas fights, if not these New York fights or these big marquee matchups that he's been in. And I think this is just one of those fights where they got Ian Gary, being fed to some of these journeyman guys. So, yeah, I'm going to go with a finish for Ian Gary on that one. And then we move on to the card. We have Julian Marquez taking on Marc-Andre Barrault. Now, many of you don't know, Julian Marquez asked Miley Cyrus out on a post-fight call-out, and notable going into this fight, I just don't think that he has the right pace to take on somebody like Marc-Andre. And also, not only on that, he seems distracted, especially with the new podcast he's got going on. And then, obviously, he does this thing with calling out Miley Cyrus, trying to be the social media influencer. And then he's got a podcast going on that he's trying to do. And this is, again, after taking a loss. Whereas you have Marc-Andre's very technical, which probably will capitalize on the wildness of Julian. So I see this with a decision win for Marc-Andre. Julian Marquez is hard to put away. I can't see Marc-Andre finishing him, but I could see Marc-Andre outpointing him in this entire fight. Then you have Amanda Ribas taking on Vivian Araujo. Once again, Vivian Araujo, 36 years old, very old for a female fighter. And you heard what I said earlier. I just think that they peak out a little bit quicker than their, let's say, male counterparts, especially in the heavier divisions. And I think that's just really what it comes down to. I think that the lighter that you fight, the more that you're going to be reliant on your speed, which, by the way, is very detrimental in the lower weight classes, more so than in the heavyweight division, which is why you historically see older heavyweights fight a lot longer with better longevity, especially somebody like, let's say, George Foreman. You see him win his world title very later on in his age. And by the way, shout out to Badu Jack, right? How he won his world title against Mokabu in the co-main event of Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury this weekend. 39 years old. Even cites and says that, hey, I'm the oldest guy in the in the cruiserweight division to ever win a title. And then, of course, became the first Muslim to win a major world title inside Saudi Arabia. So Amanda Ribas just has a lot more potential in the future, has a strong finishing potential. You know what? I can see her finishing Vivian Araújo maybe in a second round of some sort of submission, very similar to how she was able to finish off Paige Van Zant very early, and basically ended her UFC career in that and sent her to BKFC boxing. And then we have Brunson taking on Dricus du Plessis. By the way, as I mentioned earlier, he has a training partner that's fighting in this card, right? Cameron Saman, as I was mentioning, the undefeated Cameron Saman against Brunson. Brunson's coming off of an injury. He hasn't been in the cage for a year, does a lot of panic takedowns, especially with Dricus, who has great scrambles. A possible submission win for Dricus, maybe even a third round TKO. But I see this going on in the late rounds because Derek Brunson is hard to put away, not unless you're Robert Whittaker, who can take him out in the first round. But other than that, Brunson's been heavily improved ever since then. But I think the injury is going to be a factor. Dricus is somebody that they're building up. He was just coming off of that Darren Till win. They both have a win over Darren Till. So, and by the way, speaking of which, how about Darren Till recently being announced that he was removed from the UFC roster? Now, there's several factors that I want to mention about that before I go into the rest of the fights. Okay, because here's something that's really interesting to take a look at and nitpick with the current story of Darren Till right now. So here it goes. Darren Till is probably taking himself out of the USADA pool so that he can take steroids and recover from whatever injuries he has going on. That is a possibility because you've seen what happened with Conor. He got taken out of the rankings, and you think to yourself, well, why would the UFC do something like that? Maybe they're trying to create some sort of fair competitive architecture, or maybe the other side of that is, like what I said, he's just trying to take all the steroids that he can to recover. That's one possibility. The other possibility is maybe Darren Till isn't really removed from the roster, but maybe he got removed from the rankings. He's no longer a ranked fighter. Okay, then it'll be just that. That's it. That's what it will be. But it doesn't mean that he's out of the UFC. So those are the other reasons. Or the other reason is that he's had one win out of the 6 fights that he's had. So he's 1-5 in his last 6. That's enough reason for the UFC to do that. His friendship with Khamzat Chimaev doesn't really do him any good. It does great promotion for Khamzat, but it doesn't do any great for promotion for Darren Till that is coming off of these losses. So the UFC is a place where you're either winning fights or you're either selling them pay-per-views. And if you're not doing one or the other, they have no use for you. So that's the reality of what's going on with Darren Till if one of those 3 possibilities that's going on. So moving on to the card, we have somebody that they're promoting heavily right now, which is Bo Nickel taking on Jamie Pickett. Now, Bo Nickel, I think this is a tailor-made fight for him in which you're going to see him get a first-round submission and then a takedown to follow. Jamie Pickett, athletic, has skills, has limited skills in comparison to Bo Nickel in the wrestling department. And then on top of that, just the ever-growing submission game that Bo Nickel has, along with the knockout power that he has. I just think that this is a fight that was tailor-made for Bo Nickel to move up. And it's no different than with Jeff Neal versus Shavkat Ramonov, which is a 16-0 guy who has a lot of hype, has a Khamzat-like vibe about him, this Eastern European killer type of promotion that the UFC is trying to convey with him, but at the same time doesn't have that same hype or big name value that Khamzat has. Nonetheless, you're trying to build him off with somebody like Jeff Neal, who has a 15-4-0 record. I mean, it's a tailor-made fight for him. So Shavkat Rakhmonov with a finish, Bo Nickel with a finish, and then you have the two futures of the 155 division, Jalen Turner, 13-5, taking on Gamrot, 12-2-0, coming off of a loss against Beneil Dariush. Why not? It's a good fight, but I mean, I can see Jalen Turner get controlled in the same very similar fashion that he did against the Matt Frevola fight. A dangerous matchup nonetheless. I mean, the guy is tall, he's rangy, he can jab you from across the room, and especially being at 6'3" at 155, it could cause a lot of problems, but in reality, I see this as a decision win for Gamrot. So, first round finish or second round finish for Shavkat Rakhmonov against Jeff Neal, and then first round submission for Bo Nickel, and Valentina Shevchenko against Alexa Grasso. Now, I've mentioned and said that perhaps female fighters don't age well in their older age, but this is Valentina Shevchenko, and right now I just don't see a lot of female fighters, especially in her division and especially within these championship levels that she's fighting at. I just don't think that they hold a candle to her to any degree. I certainly don't think Alexa Grasso has the style to do anything with Valentina. In fact, I could see Valentina finishing this fight off in the first round. However, if Alexa Grasso doesn't want to get finished very early, I think she has to be very defensive very early on. She has to stuff takedowns and maybe even initiate the takedowns. Valentina's just going to be too strong, too experienced, and just really has a great understanding for striking to where she's going to close the distance at any range that she wants. So, at most, I can see a decision win for Valentina, but I could also see her possibly finishing her off in the later rounds, maybe third or fourth round, via TKO, ground and pound, followed by some shots on the feet. Head kick, or maybe even a right hook of some sort for her to just finish her on the ground after she got knocked down. That's how I see that fight going. Now, with Jon Jones and Ciryl Gane, I've talked about it extensively all throughout this hour, and I've talked about it in different ways. I've talked about the recency bias that people have going on. I've talked about the skills and the lack of skills that both of them bring to the table, their strengths and their weaknesses. This is a legitimate 50-50 fight in every sense of the word. And I love how I just said 50-50 fight right in the 50-minute mark of this entire podcast, because that's exactly what you're going to have. And not just a 50-50 fight, a 51-50 fight, meaning that it's crazy as it can be, because it is everything that mixed martial arts is about: chaotic, and how to understand and negotiate through those chaotic exchanges. That's one thing that this fight brings. The other thing that this fight brings is the unpredictability. Whose game is going to be implemented? Because one guy lacks in one department and the other guy excels in the other department. And what do I mean by that? Ciryl Gane is very good at his footwork, but at the same time, very weak at his wrestling. Jon Jones is very weak at his footwork, but extremely good in his wrestling. However, in the past has been susceptible to, let's say, lesser wrestlers to have taken him down, or lesser experienced guys in that department of the compository sport of mixed martial arts, which is wrestling. He's been taken down a few times with Alexander Gustafsson in their fight, even with Dominic Reyes, but then had the upper hand in that department. But then he was also getting caught with some back uppercuts from Dominic Reyes. And you got to think to yourself, what is Cyril Gane going to do when he is the quintessential real heavyweight in this particular matchup? He's always weighed over 230 pounds his entire career. Whereas with Jon Jones, he power lifted throughout a couple of years to get to this fight. And then you got to ask yourself, how limited will his skills be in comparison to the skills that he's had before? Now, this is a very hard matchup to really determine because of these factors that I had mentioned. But if I had to make a choice, and I had to only make one choice, and then obviously I'm live recording and doing this particular podcast right now, so I have to give you some sort of prediction, just like what I did with all the other fights that were in this card. I'm going to have to say Jon Jones. And why? Why do I say that? Because Jon Jones knows how to win. He knows what it feels like to fight in championship rounds, and he knows what it feels like to persevere. But he's never actually tested himself with a real legitimate heavyweight. Now, Dominic Reyes would never make the heavyweight division. Alexander Gustafsson has fought heavyweight once, or was scheduled to fight heavyweight against Ben Rothwell, never came to fruition. Nonetheless, these are not real heavyweights. And again, Dominic Reyes is never going in that division, but had the size to bring threats to Jon Jones. And then you're dealing with somebody like Cyril Gane, who is a real threat in the heavyweight that he is, in terms of the way that he moves. He moves like no other heavyweight there is. The only thing that showed that could be his kryptonite in his whole entire fight career, you've seen it in the last fight with Francis Ngannou, which is what? He got out-wrestled. Can Jon Jones do that same thing to him? Absolutely. That's why I'm leaning towards Jon Jones if you're asking me for an official prediction on that one. But on any regard, welcome to the theater of the unknown, because you never know what's going to happen in these fights, and all you can really do is predict them. You may get it right, you may get it wrong, but all you can really do is just enjoy this theater of the unknown. More coverage this week on this fight. Don't forget to follow and like and share this podcast anywhere that you can.